Okay, so I think we're going to start with the afternoon session. Thanks again to everyone for being here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Alan Hastings. Besides lettering and sailing at Cornell University and having enviable hair, Alan Hastings is well known to all of us for his work in applied mathematics and ecological dynamics, with hundreds of works that we've all seen. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, SIAM, and the Society for Math Biology. And he received the Robert H. MacArthur Award for from the Ecological Society of America in 2006. He's also the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Theoretical Ecology. Today, he'll be speaking to us about transient dynamics and ecological systems. So please, let's welcome Alan.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I guess you shouldn't share it. Before I get started, I want to say I'm really honored to be here for Chickwee's 60th birthday. And there's one thing that's very positive about Chickweee that I don't think anybody's mentioned before, and one of the ways I probably interacted with him the most is that he's a really, really good scientific citizen. And young people should listen to this because maybe more people should be doing this. He's service as a reviewer and on editorial boards is way above the norm. It's very responsible, and he really deserves extra credit for that, and certainly helped me a lot. So I'd like to thank you for that. And it's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. So much appreciated. And it's really good to be here. This is a caricature of much of ecological theory of classical, and classics actually have continued, where we have a simple model that's deterministic. Whoops, that's with X, where you have time-independent parameters. We look for the long-term behavior, and then we say that natural systems are the ones that correspond to the long-term behavior of our models. Well, I've got X's around some of the things which are not true, that we shouldn't look at systems which are deterministic. We shouldn't look at systems where the parameters are constant in time. Certainly with global change, we're very aware of that. We shouldn't look at, I call it stable equilibrium, as long-term behavior. And we also know that there's essentially no natural systems to speak of that haven't been human influenced. So in that sense, what we really should be doing is changing all of those. And I've done a little bit on time-dependent parameters working with Martin Rasmussen. And I'm not going to talk about various ways of doing stochasticity. I'm going to even suggest there that we often do that in ways that are not correct from an ecological standpoint. What I am going to focus on is the X in the bottom left. So this is an idea that we know what we look now, we can project very short term in the future, we can do linear models. That's maybe underappreciated, but we often do that sort of thing. I mean, classically, that was the way that a lot of even epidemiological work was done, etc. It doesn't get you very far, but it can be the right thing to do. We know how to do, in a mathematical sense at least, far in the future. Actually doing it may be not so simple, but we can look at the asymptotic or long-term behavior, and we linearize about attractors as ways to do that. And in between, I'll suggest that there's still a big question mark. And so these are the key issues, as I pointed out: transient dynamics, non-autonomous systems, and realistic approaches to stochasticity. And there, I'll just throw out sort of a pet peeves that other people can worry about, is that a lot of the way that's put into models is through adding on small parameter times white times normal the distributed noise term, which is exactly wrong in the sense that noise is typically small and unbounded, whereas ecological systems, I would argue, noise should be typically large but bounded. That again is much harder. So I'm only going to look at the thing in red today, and to point out that this is nothing new in a sense, and the fact that nobody ever reads anything. I'll start off with a classic book, and as you can see by the price on the cover, this is my copy I got a long time ago. Even Dover books are now $3.50 anymore. And in it, of course, it's got the classic logical terra model right there, outlined in red. And terrible notation though, to use a little k and a big K. I guess it makes sense. And underneath, don't read that too carefully, he does this point that this is just an approximation. That the k, little k is a function. People don't appreciate that. And there it is, little k is a function. It's a power series that we could expand. I had a colleague in that time of year who said to me that a lot of things we did, biologist Bob Costantino, that in football, when in doubt, punt, and if you're doing mathematics, when in doubt, use a Taylor series. You really think about stability and everything, that we do that far more than you give credit to. And so that equation with K, a constant, the way we think of, would lead to the kinds of oscillations you have here. And this has to be a mistake, because I know that Lapka knows that's not zero, and he's drawing this obviously on the log scale. And something got the lower left there, Sebastian. It's not, that can't be, it's not zero. It's a 1 or something in here, right? Because this is really a log scale he's drawing. Gotta be otherwise. Because he knew that the oscillations would not be like that. So there's the oscillations. They're closed. It's the standard thing we hear, oh, this model is unrealistic, etc. But if you really think about it, people tried to test this. This was Gauza. And what he showed was that if you look at the 3 on the right, that you put the prey in this microcosm, you add the predator eats up all the prey and goes extinct. Okay, well, let's give the prey a place to hide. You put the prey in with a place to hide. The predator goes in and eats all the prey it can find, and the predator goes extinct, and then the prey. And so he was able to achieve coexistence by scheme. And however, let's go back to Lapka. Did he really think it looked like that? No. He said that the diagram on the left is one that was valid over a short time scale. And if you added and looked at the full treatment, that you get something which is much more realistic. You either get a stable approach to a stable equilibrium, or you get divergent oscillations, and he shows the approach to the stable equilibrium. Now, we've heard a lot about epidemiology, and we'll go back to this paper, or one of the ones in this series was referred to, I guess probably this one, because somebody said 0.7, the first one. And couldn't resist this little note that Odo has mentioned, and you know, Odo is familiar to many of us. And this is a graph from there, a figure from there that we're all familiar with. The small dots are the data, and the big dots is the model, and its depth from the plague in Mumbai, at that point called Bombay. The asymptotic behavior is just what we've heard. Now, it's really important. We heard this morning that this is a really important idea, that you do go from Glenn, that you do go to the fact that the epidemic dies out. But in some sense, when trying to understand epidemics, that's not really the interesting thing. What's interesting is the total deaths, the integral under the curve, or the peak. And so what that says is that the long-term behavior is not really what we're interested in. We're really interested in the behavior, intermediate time scale, the transient behavior. So these are nonlinear transients. Transients in linear systems even are important. So one of the things I've looked at for many years. A lot of this work has been done with a long-term colleague Lou Botsford, more recently with Will White and a bunch of others. And what we did is we looked very simply at a model where you have look at what happens if you establish a marine protected area. And if you establish a marine protected area with fish that are not very mobile, that you change a system where initially you have in blue what would be the age structure. So this is a graph of the density of individuals or number of individuals versus age. You have the density of the age structure versus the age. And if there were no fishing, you'd have the blue, and with fishing, you have the red. And once you look at this, age structure is important, and you get a graph like this, where you get a filling in as you go through, and you suddenly prevent fishing, you get more and more older individuals as you go through time, and that's what drives things. And it turns out that if you actually want to go through and understand mathematically in a simple way how this works, it pays to go back to an old paper by Joel Cohen, which wouldn't surprise many people. And we use these ideas where we applied the model projections to some real species to provide insights into monitoring, to ask what species should you look at? It's not so cheap to actually count the number of fish. So which fish should you look at to see if the marine protected area is actually doing what it's doing? This is in the wake of process in the state of California where marine protected areas were established. And then the question is, once you put these in and told fishermen you put in fish there, do they actually even do what they're supposed to do? And what you want is you want to use these ideas to say you should look at fish where in the upper left, the timing, there's years on the bottom, it fills in relatively quickly, and where the change in biomass, which depends on the amount of fishing mortality, F, and the amount of natural mortality per year, M, is the change is big. So you want things where there's a big change over a short time. Spend your time counting those and not others. Okay, stepping back a little bit, this is the first paper I was involved in where we looked at long transients with a former student, Kevin Higgins. And this is the graph from the original paper on the right with some arrows added. And this is the plot of the overall numbers versus time for a model that is an integral difference equation model. And it's on the left where the movement of larvae by dispersal, you take and you have a dispersal kernel G of Y and X, which is the probability that an individual released at Y ends up at X, and the number of individuals that end up at X next year, you find by summing overall possible starting places Y, and you look at the local production of larvae, which we give by a Ricker model, and then at the bottom we have our dispersal kernel, which is a Gaussian. And if you follow on the right, as we increase R down the page, we go from 2 to 2 1/4, and by the time you get to 3, you actually have already a very long transient because you look at that time scale of 20,000 generations. And so therefore, you have this bit where all of a sudden, after a long time, there's a sudden change. It's completely deterministic, no change in parameters, no change in external conditions. Following that, I did a paper on predator-prey systems, a couple of them on that, wrote an initial sort of synthesis or review paper in 2004. And then, of course, Chigui has contributed in this area with a couple of papers on transients, one on epidemic models, which makes sense given what I said, and another on a plankton model. And can we make studies of transient systematic? Because I've given you several examples, and we'd like this to be more systematic. And so in order to do this, I had to add a number of smart people, and this was a group at Nimbus, and I guess we probably started working together around 2015 or so. and we're still meeting together on Zoom long after the funding has disappeared. Sergei Petrovsky, Mary Lou Zeman, who obviously was at this meeting virtually, Ying-Cheng Lai, Tessa Francis, Karen Abbott, Kim Cuddington, and Gabriel Gellner and Katie Scranton are now doing some other things, but the rest of us are still together, along with Andrew Morozov, and we added a couple of others on the way. These are some of the papers that we've done over the years. And the idea would be that dynamical systems essentially change the study of differential equations, more or less, from looking at special cases to something general. If you teach your undergraduate, you think, okay, so we solve an exponential differential equation, and then we solve maybe essentially the logistic equation, and you guys are just going to keep coming up with more of them for which you have exact solutions, and you sort of say, well, whoops, we don't have that many more. You do it this other way. It's dynamical systems. And so first, we need a definition of what we mean by long transients. And this is not going to be a definition in a real mathematical sense of being super precise, but sort of a waving hand, maybe an applied mathematician's definition, that it occurs when a system is not at equilibrium, and by equilibrium, it's long-term behavior. So I'm putting in not just the steady states, but long-term behavior. And by a long transient, well, it turns out that underappreciated actually within the study of ecology or mathematical ecology or theoretical ecology at times is the role of non-dimensionalization, is that there is sort of a natural scale named generation time. So we'll use that scale and define long transient as something that's sort of roughly 10 generations or more, dozens, I get a dozen generations or more there. So long enough that it looks like asymptotic behavior. And on the right here, I've got a few examples of this, where we see on the top, you have disturbance, and often the transient occurs after disturbance. The system is depressed for a while and then jumps up. On the right, it doesn't really have as much of a transient, and the bottom, there's change. So I'll return at the end of the talk to a couple of examples, but we always would joke as our group, we did lots of synthesis papers, and every synthesis paper had to have a table, preferably at least one, maybe more. And this was one where obviously this is the kind of thing you should never put in a talk. This is a figure where you can't read the diagram, you can't read what's written. But we found a number of empirical examples. Laboratory populations of flower beetles. This was a really cool paper by Bob Costantino and colleagues, and a bunch of others where you seem to have long transients. One of the examples in there is one that I worked on with Kevin, his former student I mentioned, my long-term collaborator Lou Botsford and Jacob Sarvella, and Lou's favorite organism, the Dungeness crab. So what we have on the right is a graph of landings, so catches of Dungeness crab at 8 ports, starting in the bottom right at Fort Bragg, where Lou grew up in Northern California, moving up on the upper right, Eureka and Crescent City, Brookings, Gold Beach, and then you get Coos and Wierchester Bays, then keeps going up the coast all the way to Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay and the Columbia River, which is just southern Oregon. So on the left, we have a very detailed model that we constructed, where we have eggs, and we assume that the eggs are sort of 50% male and female, and then male and female behave differently. We have a term for survivorship from eggs, and then we go on, and the males, once they are more than age 4, they get a castrated parasite, and males have to be bigger than females in order for mating to occur. So that's why we're not interested in older females. And the males are the only things you can legally harvest, and you harvest those. So you turn it out, you have very good observations. And we use that plus the stochastic model to do one step ahead fits. The one step ahead fits are really, really good on its ecology. So they're really, really good for ecology. And in the diagram on the right, you see little lollipops. The blacks are observations. The open circles are predictions. And most of the time, they're in the right direction. And it's actually a very high R squared. And we get this fit. And this fit includes stochasticity. There's a stochastic term, the square root of SA at the very top. And then there's a stochastic term on the left in the birth term. The dynamics are driven by the stochasticity. And I don't know if you know this, but the those are huge oscillations. Those are log scales of cats, so big, big oscillations. Another example of that is the data is there, but the paper is on the paper that if you are a population biologist doing modeling, you haven't read it, you should go out and read it right away, because it is one of the most insightful papers that ever has been written by Don Ludwig, and who saw this, and then with Jones and Buzz Holling, who saw the data, and Don came up with a model, which was a very qualitative sort of model of essentially spruce budworm, and he's got a model. The red dots are the data. The blue is the model. The happens because the spruce budworm is got a much faster generation time than the host tree, and that plus the interaction with birds leads to the kind of dynamics here. And we call these transients, although it's what it is that it's in this case it's repeated oscillations, but either at the low phase you would think that this is a permanent setup, and so maybe insect outbreaks really are due just to these transient dynamics, and there's more to it than that. And so one of the things that we can begin to do is to think of the idea of a ghost. This is a system that I worked on the model with Zach Powell, Tom Powell, where we have a 3 species food chain. We have a resource density, we have a consumer density, and we have a predator density. And for the parameter values in the upper half of this diagram, there's a chaotic attractor, which if you turn it on its side looks like a teacup, and a stable oscillation with the top predator absent. So the pale blue going down to the curve where the top predator is absent, the dark blue. And on the right, I show instead the same time series in terms of just the number of predators per time. And I got a green box around the time series for the chaotic attractor. I changed parameters just a little bit, and suddenly the chaotic attractor is now, there's still a chaotic invariant set, but it's no longer an attractor. And so what happens, you get the diagram on the right there, and if you look at what's in the green box, it looks exactly like the one above, and then shortly thereafter, the system collapses, no parameter change, nothing's happened. So we can see a lot of other aspects with predator-prey dynamics. And so here we're going to look at the very simple predator-prey system, where we've got the H for herbivores, the way to think between predator and prey, P for predator, and on the top we have the rate of change of the prey population, and on the bottom we have the rate of change of the predator population, and we have a functional response f of h, which we get in there. And for these parameter values, we have a stable limit cycle. We have in blue, the vertical blue line is the so-called predator isoline, If you were a mathematician, you would call it the null line because it's the one that corresponds to 0, but ecologists for some reason call it the isospin. The curved one is the prey isocline. It's the rate curve along which the rate of change of the prey is 0. And so there we have what the numbers are. If we move the predator isocline to the left by changing parameters, the system in that case gets near the origin and near the value where the predators are absent and the prey is near its carrying capacity K. By getting near saddles, well, at a saddle, what's the rate of change? If you're right on the equilibrium, rate of change is 0. So if you're near the equilibrium in phase space, the rate of change has to be very small because it's a continuous function of the state of the system. And so you get something which looks like this, and this ends up representing series, we would call in some sense a series of alternating transients, because you looks like the system is at one equilibrium, then it looks like it's at another equilibrium, and with rapid changes in between, again, nothing external. There's another kind of example, and this is one with multiple timescales. A lot of this has been looked at in the actually over a long period of time, a series of papers by Sergio Rinaldi and his colleagues, including one very nice one in volume 1 of the Journal of Ecosystems. And here you get a small parameter, but in a different sort of way, where there is a case where if you look at the light green oval, that the predator density is non-zero, but the prey density gets very, very small. And therefore, once again, if the prey density is small, the prey doesn't change very quickly through time. And again, you get what looks like if you were to focus on part of this trajectory on a transient. You can look at more details if you look at face planes more carefully, and I'm not going to go through those details, but if you have separatrix and you can have on the right, the funnel actually then pushes stuff there. You can have cases where it makes these crawlbys much more likely. 3 species competition. This is originally a model due to Maya Leonard, where you can get multiple crawlbys and approaches multiple systems, and you get these long times for one or the other. Now, I've gone through just in this table, again, multiple tables in any paper, that we have the ghost, the crawlby, and the systems with multiple timescales. And the system where I had the info difference equation, that is actually a system of very high dimension, right? Because that's another place where you can get transients. And then the system of the Dungeness crab, if I remove the stochasticity in that system, that for all but one of the cases, it would approach a stable equilibrium relatively quickly. So little bits of noise can make a system look very, very different. And we call that a transient as well. And we have a specific example of each of these. So we, in another paper by the same group led by Tessa Francis, that we said and pointed out that there's large implications for management of transients, using the idea of transient thinking. And if you look at the box in the upper right, that we have 3 different causes of transients that we're looking at: ghosts, crawlbys, and the not transient. And what this diagram is it's what's often used when people think of adaptive management. We make observations, you make changes, etc. For those that haven't heard that term, this diagram really is very similar to what you're supposed to think of as the scientific method. And in the upper right, we say, well, you might want to maintain a transient, or you might want to shorten a transient. And you've got a ghost, and if you have a ghost, then the way to maintain a transient is you have to continually push the system to keep it back on the transient. If you want to shorten it, you want to push the system in the correct direction to get it away from the transient. If you have a cold glide, well, if you want to maintain it, again, you got to push it back towards the saddle. And remember, a saddle, I drew it as though it was just in a faceplane. It could be a chaotic saddle, it could be all sorts of saddles. And if you want to shorten it, you just have to get it, push it away. And as a matter of fact, there's all sorts of interesting things with that in terms of pushing things away from saddles. And if it's not a transient, there's different things you want to do. And so even recognizing this is important. As I said, I'll return to this. And this is one simple example of thinking about management. And this is a classic example of a tipping point. And at least in the popular literature, maybe at the Mountain Blackwell level, but I think a lot of people don't go beyond that, that here we have a case where we've got projected down onto one dimension, a saddle node bifurcation. So it's not really, it doesn't look like a saddle node, but that's what it is, right? If you have some stable directions. And if you push the system, so the parameter has changed. So now you're past the point where you have a stable equilibrium present for those parameter values. You're at the position labeled S. You can take one of three actions potentially. You could push up in state space. You could push left in parameter space, or you could work on both the parameter and the state. That's action 2. And one of the things is, as you may have already guessed, that the color and length of the arrows is in this phase plane how rapid changes are. And obviously, right at the point where the stable solution, which is the solid one, and the unstable solution, which is the dashed one, meet, that the rate of change is 0. So right near there it's 0. So what the idea would be is that even if you pass the tipping point, you have time to react, as long as you know you're past the tipping point and that you are really in a transit. You have time for the system to recover, but you're better off doing the correct thing, for example, of working on both the state and the parameters of the system. And so, with apologies to those that think about tipping points, we would argue that in some sense it's just a subset of the topic of transients. And so I guess I said that. So I'm going to go through these examples and then one more. Actually, not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through one of these examples and then another one. One of them in two different ways of how this might play a role. And I'm going to go through this one twice. So this is a diagram from a paper with Julie Blackwood, a former student, where we looked at coral-algal-grazer systems. A lot of work did in collaboration with the coral biologist Pete Mumby, a great guy who takes great pictures too. And what you see on the right, the picture is a healthy reef where it's not dominated by macroalgae, and where you have lots of other fish and things. In the bottom, you have a reef dominated by macroalgae, and then it's just got the macroalgae. And if we look at the system, and you look at the color, if you look to the left where there's the sort of the curved line, every point there, if you left the system, it would go to a low coral cover state, lots of macroalgae. And on the bottom axis, we have what here we're viewing as a parameter. In other models, we made actual variable that depended on the number of parrotfish in the model, which we're doing with grazing. And if we look and we managed to remove fishing on the parrotfish, every colored dot on the left after 5 years would end up in a corresponding colored dot on the right. And so you see that those can recover again in the same way that if we change the parameters of the system, we can move without, and if we change the parameters in the state, we would get there even faster. Now, up to this point, I've done everything deterministic. One response might be, well, this is all kind of interesting from a mathematical standpoint, but I've already said that stochasticity is important. And I didn't quite do everything deterministically. There was that one stochastic system. But we add stochasticity and this all goes away. And the answer would be that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So this is another paper from this group. And if we think of two simple examples, give hints about what can go on. And I'll do this just with a series of a few examples. One is something I've worked on for a while, mainly the blue phosphor, is salmon. And salmon have the property that some of you may know that most individuals, salmon are what are called anadromous, a nice word that you can use if you crosswords or something. That means that they reproduce in fresh water and then they go out to salt water to essentially grow up and come back to fresh water to reproduce. And almost all individuals reproduce at the same age. I guess it should really say age, not year. And so if we start with almost all individuals in the same single year class, so let's say every individual reproduces when they're age 2, which is something that. If they're almost all in the same year class, that yes, and there's a few in another year class, eventually the classes will, and there's a small number that reproduce either early or late, that slowly it will approach a stable age distribution with the same number of individuals in every year class. Say, but if the system is stochastic, you're more likely to get there faster. Okay. So that's one example. Another one is basically sort of like that Dungeness crowd example. So think of a predator prey system. We've already seen that, we've already seen the diagram, so hopefully you can recall that a lot of predator prey systems, they oscillate, but they approach the stable equilibrium. And in a really nice paper back in the 70s, I guess, Bill Gurney and Roger Nisbet pointed out that if you give this system constant stochastic kicks, and you looked, say, at the dynamics by doing some sort of frequency analysis of the spectrum, then it would be completely indistinguishable from an oscillation. So in some sense, the stochasticity in one case shortens a transient, in the other case lengthens it. And this is another simple example. Just chose some parameter values for a system with a Lee effect. We add the 0.01 to just prevent immigration. The deterministic system has two equilibria near 0 and 1. This is a system with a Lee effect. And we add a little bit of noise. And we go from, in the top diagrams, I'll go back there for a second, which are for the same level of noise. If you start at a near 1, you basically stay near 1, bounce around there. If you start near 0, you bounce around near 0. You eventually the system would flip, but you have to wait a long time. You increase the noise a little bit more, and you really do get real transients on observable time scales where you flip back and forth between the two equilibria driven by the noise. This is something where obviously for things like this, this is probably simple enough. You could do an analysis. There's ways to do this that are pretty nice. And you pick the noise up more, and it just looks like the noise. And one more thing is a type 3 functional response. you get a system like this, which is an example of an excitable system. And you get a case where systems will, a little bit of noise in figure A, and then you put a little bit more noise in figure B, or row B, the intermediate noise, and you kick the system out of the case, and it goes through an excursion and returns, and so in some sense you generate a transient. And the idea would be that the slope of the two isoclines determines the stability. So in A, it's a stable equilibrium, but if you kick it a little bit ways away, the isocline is then pointing the other direction. And so the system takes a long excursion. And then if you have lots of noise, well, it's a different kind of transient, maybe the way we talk, but just continually going that way. And then there's all sorts of other complex interactions. Mary Lou Zeman in particular has looked at slow kick ideas, which in other contexts are called impulsive differential equations. And as I said, the role of chaotic invariant sets, etc. And so it clearly plays a role in management. I'm going to go back to this coral system. This is one that I mentioned before, and in multiple states. I wrote down this before. This would be what it looked like. You had the grazer, and then colonized by turf. We can write down equations, and we can even add in the parrotfish, and that's what we did. Very recently, and I'm going to finish up in the last sort of few minutes here with two examples. So one is something that just did recently. Again, Carl Hock was a postdoc working with Pete Mumby, so back working with Pete again, and a bunch of other colleagues from Australia. In the meantime, Pete has moved from, previously was in England, and now he's in Australia, so thinking about Great Barrier Reef. And here we had coral recruits R, adult coral C, and macroalgae M. And we add in the consideration of the larval supply. Local recruitment is proportional to the local cover plus the external larval supply. When the idea here would be that this may be a step towards thinking about management along the barrier reef as to what you should be doing in order to protect various sites, how much of a role do you get from other locations, etc. You multiply the number of recruits times the empty space in order to get, and you multiply that by K in order to get the number of recruits, number of settlements, change in the coral recruits. You have the growth to adult removes recruits. The overgrowth by macroalgae removes recruits, and the depth obviously removes recruits. The macroalgae overgrow coral and free space at the same rate. So we have the coral term is in the middle, and that's just the maturing recruits, the AR term that we mentioned. And then, whoops, pushed that too fast. And then we have a grazing term where the grazers, what's interesting is the grazers depend on the coral. They both depend on the coral, essentially habitat, and then they consume macroalgae. And we've got those equations. We assume the recruit stage only lasts one time step. So at any time step, the recruit numbers are completely determined by adults and macroalgae. And so we have a full model for the number of coral and the number of macroalgae when we plug those all in. And the overall idea is the model still has similar tipping point behavior. So near the tipping point, we get slow changes, a typical transient that goes. And we get a system that looks like this. So we can look at coral cover in terms of how much external supply we have, and you can follow the trajectories. And so we still have a diagram in the lower left, which looks like the one or on the left, which shows you the external larval supply, but we still have a tipping points where we can either have very low coral cover the vertical axis is coral cover, or we can have very high coral cover. And it depends on the amount of external supply. And so we get, in terms of the coral cover, if we look at the red, we have a window of observation, and we could be in a transient zone, we could be heading towards the bad state of no coral cover, or heading towards the good state of high coral cover, but we could also be in the transient zone where we don't know what's going to happen. And we have transients emerge near the basin boundary. And the overall idea is that if we have stochasticity, whoops, what did I do? Look at scenarios with variable recruitment with a single pulse, and then what you end up getting is taking the diagrams I just had, you give it a pulse. And pulses occur because there are disturbances here. They can be negative disturbances, coral bleaching, crown of thorns starfish, warming events, and that would then push things down, or you can get potentially something intervention, which would change the basin boundary, and again, then you can push stuff if they're near a transient. So you can use these ideas, and now if you make the normal supply transient, the things coming from external, which change in currents, change in potentially other things you would control, and once again, you get the same sorts of ideas of flipping between things, and part C, you have a supply failure. What does that do? It takes things which were in the transient zone, has them towards the bad of low coral cover. If you give them enhanced supply, where something happens, that can happen. And in the transient zone, systems take a long time to recover. And what we see. The last thing I want to mention is recently have been looking at these ideas in terms of anaerobic digesters. If you don't know what those are obviously anaerobic, no oxygen. They play a big role in sewage treatment plants. There's a standard model for their dynamics. And what we can do is we can take that standard model, we can use the standard simplification of it, we can add stochasticity, and basically try and understand, can we predict these things do have transients? Can we predict the end of transients? And this is a simple description of what we're doing. Chris Hegerud, the co-author on this, is a postdoc with me right now. We'll be going to Manitoba in a year for a faculty position. Study of transient dynamics. We use the well-understood model to create synthetic data, and then we can use ideas of essentially mapping the data using an approximation method called the S-map that George Sujihara and colleagues have done a lot of work with, and use that as a way to try and predict the end of the transient. And that's what we've done. So the conclusions that I want you to go away with are basically that you can think about transients. It's really important to think about them in terms of the role of management. You want to think about the challenges to really finish all the X's in this diagram. And I told you only about the bottom left one, but the other two are really important. And the real world basically falls into a case where deterministic and stochastic processes interact, and where these transients play a big role. And if you want the very most up-to-date, this just came out last week, an update on the earlier review that appeared in Physics of Life Reviews by Andrew Morozov, which et al., which was a longer version of the paper in Science, because you couldn't put equations and big like that even in the online thing in Science. And so I'll ask for questions. In the meantime, just in case you're interested, I'll leave up a bunch of other references and not that very last one. So thank you for your attention. Happy birthday again to Shigui. And I'll be happy to answer the questions.